The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. Gregory Carli, Executive Advisor, leads the Sustainability, Resilience, and ESG practice within GHD's advisory team. Mr. Carli oversees the strategic integration of sustainability and resilience principles into a broad range of client solutions across GHD's market segments of water, transportation, environment, property and buildings, and energy. Mr. Carli's focus areas include ESG integration, climate risk management, and sustainable infrastructure. Mr. Carli brings over 25 years of experience providing innovative solutions to clients throughout North America and globally in his role as Executive Advisor and formerly as a leader in the EHS&S practice. He has completed numerous sell-side and buy-side assessments for corporates, private equity firms, investment banks and debt providers, and has provided advice in many jurisdictions around the world. Now let's get into the episode with Greg.
Lysandra, it is great to be back, and I'm so glad we have Greg back with us to talk about the standards. So welcome back, Greg, as well.
Thank you again for having me. It's a pleasure talking to this group. The last one was a really insightful conversation, and looking forward to another one today.
So today we'll be talking about the implications and preparations for Canadian companies on Canadian Sustainability Disclosure Standards, also known as CSDS. And Dave will get us kicked off with the first question.
Lysandra, I'm so glad you gave the full acronym because it's a tongue tire, and I'm just going to use the CSDS as I go forward so I don't get caught up with the verbiage. So, Greg, my first question would be, what impact will the CSDS have to Canadian companies? Can you share with us?
Yeah, and ultimately, I think, Dave, it's going to have a positive impact. It'll be a little bumpy initially as companies get used to a new standard, but ultimately it will be a really positive impact to help companies address their wider efforts on climate change. Whether it's a 2030 goal or a 2050 goal they're trying to set, the standards will really help them, give them a platform and guardrails, if you will, to work within to achieve those standards and report out on those standards to their stakeholders. So again, whether that be an investor or their customers or their own employees. So it really does give them that way of reporting things in a clear, consistent, transparent manner that aligns with other standards to help reduce some of the friction around reporting. But you're seeing that huge convergence of global standards, and Canada's no different. We're not earliest adopters. We're not following far behind either, but we're in the middle there and a nice sweet spot. So this will really help companies to advance their reporting efforts. Many Canadian companies are already doing this, and they're already voluntarily reporting. So this will give them more guidelines and more information to do that and help be clear about it. We saw in a study we did here at GHD recently with executives, over 25% of executives are asking for more clarity in this space. They are looking for this because of the conflicting information globally. And I think it's really positive that we're moving forward. But to get to that ultimate point, I think it is about companies really embedding sustainability in their DNA and getting sustainability, less as an add-on, right? Historically, there's the sustainability team. There's the business, and then there's the sustainability team. And I think standards like this will help to really integrate that further into their business and their organization. So sustainability becomes in their DNA. We want to get to a point where every employee, every person involved in the organization is thinking about sustainability, what it means to their job. And standards like this will help and take a big step forward for that.
Just to follow up on that, Greg, understand standards. You'll have some organizations that will be brand new to it. Yep. And then some that will have been working in some capacity the last 2 years, 3 years, maybe longer. Will the standards evolve dependent on the client's maturity of what they've done in sustainability? Do you know how that progresses with the standard?
There are some thresholds, without getting too far into the weeds, on how companies will be required to move forward with the standards. So there are some dates and some triggers within the standards that help them not have to do everything at once. It's really important that the companies sit down and understand how the standard will apply to them and sort of grow with it, right? And again, being a voluntary standard at this time, I think this is part of the thinking that CSSB, or the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board, is looking at. By making it voluntary initially, companies can adopt that at a pace that makes sense for them and grow with it as a result. And I think the worst thing we can do to companies in Canada is throw a standard out there that's mandatory, that requires them to put some significant burden on, that will really impact them on a financial basis. And we don't want that to happen.
Very good point. Thank you.
A few times, even though the standards will initially be voluntary, how influential do you think they will be in shaping future mandatory sustainability disclosure rules?
I think they'll be highly influential in that, Lysandra. Ultimately, because there's such an alignment between the CSDS standards and standards like ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board standards, I would see little change in the standards over the coming years that aren't changes to international standards. They really are designed to be a mirror of international standards to reduce burden on Canadian companies in particular. Everything I've read, everything I've heard is that these will become mandatory at some time. This is a pattern we've seen in other jurisdictions in Europe. There's the CSRD, which is a similar standard, but that was initially sort of voluntary, and now it's being ramped up to different companies based on their thresholds over time. You're seeing regulation come in Australia and India and elsewhere, so it will come. It really it gives, I think, a platform for Canadian companies to start doing things, as we were talking about in the last question, to get going forward. I think this will be my prediction. If I had a crystal ball, in some point in the next 2 to 3 years, we'll see a mandatory standard and pretty much look like what the ISSB standards are.
So, Greg, we're very fortunate you belonging to a global organization. So my next kind of question for you is, based on the learnings from other countries, what are some of the common challenges organizations face when they're gathering or reporting on sustainability-related information?
Yeah, it can be a real challenge, Dave, and there can be a lot of effort upfront into this. And there's several aspects of that. One is understanding what it means to you as an organization, both from a regulatory perspective, but also from what's material to you. What are you actually using in your business to make decisions around sustainability? We call that a materiality assessment, right? A big fancy word. For what it means is looking at what does sustainability to mean to you as an organization. And I think sometimes companies want to jump too fast to gathering data and starting to report on something like greenhouse gas emissions, and they need to step back a little bit and start to think first. What does this mean to us, and what is the implications of it, so they can start to meaningfully grow with that and gather data that actually makes sense for them. There are data they're going to be required to report on, such as Scope 1 and Scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions. But beyond that, there may be some other things that are going to be really important to them. So it's taking stock of where you sit today. We've seen that in our work here at GHD with a number of global entities, really taking stock of where you are today and understanding that from a meaningful perspective. Then building on that, and it really comes down to a data collection piece. It really is important that data be collected well and be accurately collected, and the right data is being collected. And that's why it's so important to really understand what is meaningful to you. Otherwise, you can spend a lot of time and effort collecting data that's fairly meaningless and not really going to be useful to you beyond meeting some reporting checklists that maybe you don't even need to be reporting on. So starting to understand that is something we've seen with other global entities that have been a little more advanced in this space than some of our Canadian peers are, but that's really key. And that accuracy in data is so critical, right? Similar, if you make the analogy to some of the financial reporting standards that already exist, right? This isn't that different from some of the typical accounting standards we've seen. So we all know the importance of getting accuracy in financial information, the dollars and cents of a company. That's really critical. It's very similar here, right? And making sure that you have accurate data, you've spent the time to validate internally that it's making sense, and it really is the right data that you're putting out there from a disclosure perspective, right? I think the last part, though, is just maybe I'll touch on governance a little bit here, too. And I know it's a really boring topic for a podcast, but it really is about making sure that you do have the structures in place as a company, and having important frameworks that you're working with around decision making is pretty important, too. We've learned that in a global scale.
Thank you, Greg.
Flip side, how can Canadian companies with operations in regions like the US and Europe, which already have mandatory sustainability standards, leverage their existing compliance processes?
Yeah, I think that's the key here, right, Lysandra? If you are already doing this, It's really about gap assessing to the Canadian standard, which hopefully isn't a huge gap. If you're already following things like ISSB standards, then it shouldn't be a huge lift for an organization. But companies that have been doing this on an international basis and work internationally, they kind of have an advantage. They're at the forefront of this. They already understand this type of regulation and what's required. And it's really just about pivoting a little bit or modifying what they're already doing. No Canadian company who's already doing sustainability reporting on an international scale should be really fundamentally changing anything they're doing. It's just making some tweaks to what they're already doing to align to things, which goes back to that importance for Canadian companies that aren't already reporting to get some early adoption and start down this path, because they will be left behind if they don't start to embrace some level of voluntary reporting sooner rather than later.
So Greg, I've got my last set of question, and there's actually a two-part to it. And so what should Canadian organizations do now with take to prepare for the mandatory implementation of CSDS? And the second part is, what could be the consequences of non-compliance associated with this?
Sure. I think there are some very, very basic steps that every company should be doing. And it starts with that baselining, really starting to baseline. What are you doing today? I don't think most companies fully understand that. They're probably doing more than they think they are. So getting a real handle around that internally is critical. And it gives you an opportunity then as a company to start engaging your internal stakeholders, the different departments within a company. This is going to touch on legal. This is going to touch on the human resources department. This is going to touch on the finance department. This is going to touch on your engineering and operations department. So it's a great opportunity to start getting engagement and better understanding across the business. So really that baselining and then gap assessing against what the voluntary requirements are, with that comment earlier that the mandatory requirements will probably be pretty similar to the current voluntary ones. It gives you an opportunity to understand the gaps between what you have today and where you need to be a year down the road, 2 years down the road, and start to build a plan. Come up with that roadmap, the steps you need to take and over the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months in order to move that forward. What's really important in that, though, is starting to understand the cost, because there is a significant cost to this. So setting budgets and understanding what this is going to be required. Do you have the resources to do this? How can you leverage external resources in this process? And, we find that there's, most sustainability teams internally are pretty small and need help and support externally as well. And that's really, really key to do it. Don't do it on your own. Reach out to people who have knowledge in this area who can help accelerate faster for you and take lessons learned is really important as well. So making sure you have that budgeted and the resources necessary to complete what you're going to need to do is important. And if you don't factor that in, you get down the road and you're like, oh my, this is something we haven't budgeted and we need to take care of as well. But really it's, again, then I think once you've done some of those basics, it's sitting down and really starting to think as a company, what can we do to move this from a compliance position to an opportunity position, right? We talked previously about going beyond that compliance and looking at the opportunities here. How do we look at ways we can be adding value to the business through efficiency, through reducing waste, through engaging your employee base better, whatever the case may be, or engaging your customers better, or even it can be, we've seen new opportunities for revenue streams that you didn't notice before because you looked at it differently. So it really is important to do that and set the platform then for growth, for adding commercial value through sustainability and really going beyond that compliance into capitalizing on the opportunities that are created here. And consequences side, let's maybe just sit there for a second. Yeah, it's not clear yet what some of the consequences could be. And obviously, I think it's really important for the listener to understand that CSSB doesn't have any authority to make these mandatory. That would be other agencies within the Canadian government that would ultimately do that and set those consequences. But we are seeing hypothetically, in the European Union, for example, there can be some significant fines, tens of thousands of dollars in fines if they're not reporting to the CSRD, which is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in the EU. If they're not reporting to that, there can be fines to the organization. So there are some teeth to these things. Some of this is being tested by courts right now and how they go forward. So there is some uncertainty, I guess is maybe the best way to put it, in terms of what some of the hard costs and consequences would be. But I think what is really clear to me, Dave, and really important why you asked this question is the consequences to business if they don't act in terms of falling behind their competitors and their peers, starting to lose trust with their suppliers or their customer base or their investors. Those are, I think, are the bigger costs in my mind. If you don't start down this journey and do something meaningful for you as a company, the consequences to you as a business could be quite significant. Again, if you're not understanding your climate risks, it could be huge costs to you. If you're not understanding the changing economy and the changing structures of how things are done, you may be in an industry that actually might not exist 5 or 10 years down the road. And if you're not thinking about planning for that now and transitioning to something different, you may be out of business in 5 or 10 years. So I think those are the bigger consequences that companies need to start thinking about. I know that can be a really hard conversation in an organization because you're making money doing something today. We're working with some natural gas distribution companies, and they're looking at the fact that 10, 15 years from now, people aren't going to be using natural gas the way they are today. So, what does that mean for them as an organization? That's something they need to start thinking about. Probably not going to be an impact for the next couple of years for sure, but certainly 5, 10, 15 years down the road when more and more companies are electrifying, natural gas is going to be something that may not be as a significant revenue stream for them, and they need to start positioning for that sooner rather than later.
Yeah, another example, Greg, as you would be well aware of, just look at the automotive sector of how that's changing so
Absolutely.
dramatically. That's an industry that I did have a follow-up, and because you conveyed that it takes time and budget when you're dealing with these standards, typically. And I know it will vary depending on the organization, but what departments will need to be involved in this? Because it's not, from our experience, it's never just one department. And if it is, that's a failure. There should be a variety of departments. So can you convey to our listeners who should be exposed and be aware of this?
Yeah, I think some of the key ones are legal, general counsel, or chief risk officer, depending on what that's called in an organization. That side of the business is really important. Obviously, the CFO needs to be funded. This has huge implications from a bottom line perspective, both from a physical cost to comply, but also the broader business in terms of that risks and opportunities piece. Typically, the CFO in the finance department is a key one as well. Increasingly, we're seeing a sustainability department or a chief sustainability officer in an organization. Obviously, that would be one as well. That's pretty critical. But it's really important to look at the operations side of the business as well. What we've learned over the last number of years working with clients in this space is you can make all the plans you want in the sustainability and risk and finance team. But if operations hasn't been, they're the ones who have to do it, right? So when we talk about net zero planning and decarbonization of operations and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the people that ultimately have to do that are the operations and the engineering team. So I think that's a really important area and group to engage in. What we've seen really effective at GHD is bringing that deep engineering technical strength. For those who don't know GHD, at our core, we're an engineering company. That's what we do. But linking that engineering and bringing engineers together with strategists and people who are sort of at the finance side, bringing those people together is really important, because if you don't have that strategy without engagement of the technical solutions, it's not going to get realized, and you're not going to capitalize on those opportunities. At the end of the day, a lot of this comes down to really technical issues. When you look at decarbonization and reducing greenhouse gas emissions or adaptation of operations to climate risk, there really are technical things in there. And that's a really important area to focus on, and engaging those technical authorities within the organization is really critical early on.
Thank you for that.
Another great episode. Greg, to end us off, what is the biggest takeaway for our listeners?
Yeah, great. I think a great way to sort of wrap things up, Lysandra. Look, I don't want to get on a high horse for a minute, but the world is in a climate crisis, right? There is a lot happening out there. We are looking at huge impacts to our economy that are happening day in, day out, whether that's through hurricanes, increasing number of hurricanes. We've already seen a pretty active hurricane season here in North America. Whether that's increased flooding, we've seen that happening, more wildfires, more issues related to heat, more social issues related to inequities between different groups as well. We have a huge, huge crisis on our hands. I often joke with clients that we kind of had this mini crisis a few years ago called the pandemic that's actually set us up for this bigger crisis, global crisis, which is called climate change. So we got some lessons learned. We got some things we can do. We know preparation and being agile and resilient is key. But we're talking, I think, some estimates in the neighborhood of $16 billion an hour or $1 million per hour of impact on our economy due to climate change. So, it's not a small issue and it's really important. So the key takeaway from that is early adoption and getting involved early and starting to plan out your journey is key. We mentioned earlier in the podcast, getting prepared, understanding what this means to you as an organization, doing those basics around baselining yourself, benchmarking against regulations, gap assessment, so you can start early, start small, so it doesn't have a huge financial impact on you on a day-by-day basis, so that you can start to get to what is ultimately a long-term sustainability position. Right? I like to think of sustainability as a business model that helps you be really year over year growing and stable as a company. And that's really important. And these frameworks and guidelines that are being developed and starting to increasingly become mandatory globally are there to help do that. They're help to set the standards so that you have a level playing field, you have clarity as a business of what you need to do and what you should be doing. So the standards are there, the information is there, it's increasingly being more clear what that looks like. And really the opportunity and key takeaway is getting things going, really understanding what your climate risks are, understanding what those opportunities are that we've talked about and so critical, and getting, starting to reframe the conversation in your organization so that things like CSDS is not just about another regulation. It's really about how can your company move towards what, investment, growth, and opportunity as an organization, both in Canada and internationally.
Dave, to end off this episode, what's your biggest takeaway for our listeners?
I think, in summary, we're based in the Toronto area. There was massive flooding, and I read in the paper that that's $4 billion worth of cost because of flooding. Out west, which is primarily for our listeners that are from the United States and other parts of the world, where it's pretty oil and gas oriented, and there's wildfires now that they're shutting down oil and gas production because of the wildfire. So everyone is being impacted. And Greg, I think you're ringing the bell, and especially because we've been doing it, people like yourself conveying it, it's just as important and more important. I'm going to say, as a Canadian, and you also said this, I think alluded to it, we tend not to be the first front on this type of thing. But I'm going to say to you, I think we have to start moving much faster, or else our economy could suffer dramatically. And so we need, as a business and as a country, to get moving. And so these standards, I'm really hopeful will give us that foundation to actually move that direction.
David, can I just build on that for 1 second? Because I think you touched on something really important, is ultimately to move these things forward and address these big picture items, capital is going to be needed, right? Companies are going to need capital to do some of this. And obviously the return on investment for that capital is a critical decision maker. But access to capital is going to be really important. And if Canadian companies don't move, they're going to have a harder time getting access to capital. And that capital is going to get more expensive because we are sitting next door to one of the largest economy in the world. And they're going to have a lot easier access to that capital than we are. So if we don't, as Canadian companies, start to move fast, we will get left behind, and it's going to get more expensive. It's only going to get more expensive to start addressing climate change as you move forward. And that's a really critical point you make about getting moving soon, because it's only going to get more expensive and the capital is going to get harder to get to.
And the resources available to help you with this will become leaner and tougher to get. Like companies like GHD, you have only a certain amount of capacity. So as people line up, there'll be a longer wait and could be more expensive.
That's right.
So same for 316. So there is real merit to move quickly on this. And I'm hopeful our listeners, whether you're Canadian, American, European, there's real merit to get going. So Greg, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on the podcast. This has been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed talking to you both.
Have a great week. That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360 Energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn post. See you next week.